Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's ARI Institute seminar, where we've got a special presentation from three presenters on a really exciting project called the Platy Patch project and recovery initiative. So we've got a nice spread of science, on-ground application, and some innovative kind of technology, which hopefully will be of interest to everyone on the call. My name's James Todd. I'm the Chief Biodiversity Officer and Director of ARI Institute, and I'll be chairing today's seminar, and I've got technical support from Andy and Tess. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land that I'm coming from today. I'm at Heidelberg and on the land of the Wurundjeri people, and to pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to extend that acknowledgement to the lands of the various, to the traditional owners on the lands that you're coming from today, and pay my respects to elders past and present of those particular groups, and also to acknowledge that some of the work that you'll be hearing about today is taking place on particular traditional owner country. I'd also like to extend a welcome and respect to any traditional owners or Aboriginal people who might be joining us today. So as I mentioned, we've got a real focus today on the Platy Patch Recovery Initiative, which is a really exciting project that's been co-funded by state and federal governments, plus input from a range of organisations, some of you will hear today. We'll lead off with ARI scientist Magdalena Nystrand. Then we'll hear from Chris Wilson from the Glenelg Hopkins CMA, and then finally Rhys Coleman from Melbourne Water. So with that, and I should say, if you've got some questions, please wait until the end. You can put them in the chat, and the team will gather those up for questions at the end, and we should have enough time. But with that, I'll hand over to Magda, and enjoy, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks for that introduction, James. So, as James mentioned, I'm here to talk about the Platy Patch. In addition to James' address, I just wanted to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands where I am, the Wurundjeri people, and all the lands on which we are variously meeting today. So just a bit of background to better understand the project and some general facts about platypus for you who may not be fully across everything. So they're semi-aquatic and long-lived, polygynous mating system, and probably the most striking feature is that they're monotremes, so they're egg-laying mammals. They lay 1 to 3 eggs, and if everything goes well, this is what we end up with at the end of that. Habitat requirements, so they do like overhang, pools and riffles, coarse substrate, in-stream wood, reliable surface flows are some of the defined features that do benefit platypus. They also use burrows. So there's two sort of burrows. One's a camping burrow, which is more for resting and can be used by several different animals. And there's also, so you see the camping burrows on the left-hand side here, the two photos with orange arrows. And there's also the nesting burrows where they incubate and care for their young, which you see on the right-hand photo here. In terms of diet and behavior, they mainly feed underwater and they eat a lot, up to 30% of their body weight each day, even higher numbers than that have been recorded. They use sensory and electroreceptors in the bill to navigate and possibly find their prey, which is basically invertebrates, so anything from caddisfly, mayfly, water bugs, water beetles to fresh shrimp, snails, mussels. They can be quite indiscriminate with their food choices. In terms of distribution, you do find them along most of eastern Australia and down to Tasmania, as you can see on the map on the upper right. Zooming in on Victoria, you find them in most of the state except the northwest part of Victoria. So while the general distribution is relatively widespread, there are local losses and reductions in numbers. So, for instance, we have heavy declines and losses around Melbourne, Campaspe River, Upper Barwon River, to name a few. Whereas we do find quite stable populations in the Grampians region, such as the Mackenzie Fall population. But the overall mounting evidence is that it is declining, and it has both in abundance and distribution over the past 30 years, which has led them to be listed as near threatened on the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, vulnerable in Victoria since 2021, and endangered under South Australian legislation. And there has been an increasing amount of research nominating the species for threatened status nationally due to both the decline in range and the population, with suggested numbers of up to 32% reduction over the past 50 years alone, and local extinction across up to 40% of its range. While these numbers can be a bit unreliable because they're building on historical data, I think the general consensus is that they are indeed declining. So what's driving this decline? Well, there's been a large body of work looking at various threatening processes, most of which relate to habitat loss and degradation. And on the left-hand side here, I've listed some of the key ones identified. So loss of riparian vegetation, livestock grazing, land clearing in urban development, bushfires and floods, river regulations such as dams and weirs, and also fishing bycatch mortality and litter entanglement, which is obviously a bit of an outlier, causing more of a direct mortality. So the loss and degradation resulting from these processes are many. Some of them are listed here. So for instance, if we look at something like loss of riparian vegetation, it can cause less shading and shelter, a decrease in bank stability, reduction in water quality, a reduction in connectivity, and increased fragmentation. Likewise, bushfires and floods could cause reduced water quality. Drowning, which is more of a direct thing again, it specifically could affect young in the burrows. It can result in reduced connectivity and increased fragmentation. And all of these relationships are obviously examples. There's going to be more relationships that are not outlined here, and also interactions between the processes per se, so that land clearing and urban development will result in loss of riparian vegetation, as will livestock grazing. So some of the main implications of this habitat loss and degradation are fewer suitable sites for burrows, resulting from processes such as decreased bank stability and less shading and shelter, for instance. A decrease in macroinvertebrates, the main source of food, increased predation resulting from reduced connectivity and increased fragmentation, which may force animals to move more on land, for instance, and be more exposed because there's less shading and shelter. And reduced genetic diversity from populations being isolated from each other due to fragmentation. And ultimately, all these factors will feed into the 4 pillars of population dynamics. So reproduction, mortality, emigration, and immigration, affecting population numbers. And most, if not all, of these factors are likely to be amplified by climate change. So I just thought I wanted to illustrate the complexity in assessing the impact of different threats when taking into account the various possible relationships outlined in the previous slide for platypus and other species. So I thought I'd show you an example from a report from last year that was led by Sally Lardis and Jared Lyon and colleagues here at ARI, and Melody Serena from APC. So in this work, they identified the main threats to platypus and mapped them out where platypus occur within Victoria. And if you look at the individual maps, we can get a pretty good idea where the habitat looks okay and where it's less okay. However, combining all these 3 maps, the okay areas are suddenly not as many anymore. And we can have a situation there where many of these locations are effectively working as sinks, which means that the mortality is higher than reproduction, and the population can only sustain itself if there is an emigration into the area. So these areas will be specifically extra sensitive to fragmentation, for instance. So on the back of this, ARI joined forces with Melbourne Water and catchment management authorities to apply for funding from federal government scheme led by Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water, Urban River and Catchments Grant. So we applied for funding to improve riparian and in-stream habitat for platypus and 16 other named EPBC species that would likely benefit from this work, including fish species, 4 plant species, a skink and 2 frogs, and a bird and a bat. I won't go into detail on those additional species. We're using platypus is flagship species for this grant. So in the proposal of this grant, we focused on 3 of these threatening processes mentioned earlier, which is the riparian vegetation, livestock grazing, and river regulation. And as you would have guessed by now, we were successful, and we were lucky enough to secure a 4-year grant worth about $24 million. Over 9 million of these came from federal government, and there was a cash contribution from state government. In addition, there's a number of partners as listed on the right-hand side of this slide, Melbourne Water being the largest contributor to substantial funding. There are also a number of in-kind partners providing expertise and support, such as SUSVIC, APM, Australian Platypus Conservancy, and Landcare, to name a few. So very briefly, there's 2 parts to this grant. So there is 15 intervention sites, and 14 of these are in 10 regional centres, and that's where on-ground works will take place. The other site is Monbulk Creek, which is the Melbourne Water-led project, part of this project. So that will be a little bit different, and it revolves around the installation of a smart water network, which will address stormwater issues and provide environmental flows. And I won't go into details on this because you'll hear from Rhys Coleman a bit later today, who will give you all the insight on this project. You'll also hear a case study from Rhys Wilson in Glenelg Hopkins on some of the on-ground works that's happening. But in brief, the on-ground works is pretty stock standard with woody weed control and revegetation across most of the sites. There's some in-stream wood across 6 sites, fencing and erosion control. There's also quite a heavy focus on promotion, outreach and engagement with this project. So lots of events are planned, as well as lots of comms output. They are likely to be much more than what's listed here because it's gained a lot of interest already 1 year into the project. So lastly, I would just touch a little bit on the monitoring and research of this grant. Obviously, with such a substantial investment, there needs to be some accountability and evaluation, which ARI is responsible for. So this slide shows a conceptual map of outlining the interventions at the bottom. So the main 3 ones, the riparian vegetation, fence installation, and in-stream log. And on the y-axis, we have a time frame of the expected response, which is illustrated in these boxes in the diagram. So in short, we will do before and after surveys as a requirement of this program. So the before surveys include a baseline survey, which we actually just finished across a subsample of sites. And it will be focused on vegetation surveys only. And the reason for this is that that's where we expect to see a change within the life of this project. We already know that there's platypus in these work sites. So there's been eDNA surveys, there's been pike netting and citizen surveys recently in these sites. So there's not really a need to go in and do more focused animal surveys. There will be some short output reporting, which is in the short term short-term, mainly driven by the CMA. So that's kind of the standard output reporting that's done after an intervention has taken place. At the end of the project, we'll go back to the survey sites and do an after survey, which is looking at how it's evolved over the 3 years, 2 to 3 years since the works were implemented. The program has a 10-year vision or outcome objective, which is not really funded, but we'll try to get to that indirectly by looking at long-term outcomes using a research approach. So this will mainly be a combination of desktop analysis, field surveys, and predictive modeling, with the aim of quantifying how platypus activity changes across a range of habitat conditions, also taking into account interactions with flow. So in doing so, we hope to get a better idea of what we expect to see in locations where interventions have occurred, with the aim of adding to existing work, and get a better idea of what sort of conservation efforts and where will be of most benefit to platypus. It's still early days, so this component hasn't really started yet. I hope to have some actual results from this in 2 or 3 years down the track. So it will be exciting to see what comes out of this. And with that, I have finished my part of this presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and on to Chris Wilson from Glenelg Hopkins.
Thank you, Magdalena. And today I'm here to discuss some of the on-ground works that have been completed within the Glenelg Hopkins catchment, with a particular highlight on some of the activities on a particular site in southwest Victoria. So to assist us in getting our bearings, the site that I'll talk about today is located in southwest Victoria, approximately 3 hours from Melbourne, north of the coastal town of Warrnambool on the Great Ocean Road. It's in an area named Woodford, with the works occurring on the Jubilee Park Reserve, which you can see in the bottom right hand of this presentation slide. The reserve is surrounded by the ARI River, and it's a highly utilised and valued park by residents in the community, has a playground, tennis courts, and it's adjacent to the local Woodford Primary School. Importantly, it has a known population of platypus, which are regularly sighted from the walking trails, and it was also confirmed the presence of platypus via monitoring earlier this year. So before we jump into the on-ground works, I wanted to provide a bit of a background on the historic ARI River landscape. So the map up the top left-hand corner is from 1848 and describes the historic condition of the ARI River as having rich soil, thick forest of gum and lightwood, swampy areas of tea tree, she oak hills, and open forests of gum. And essentially, that is a very stark difference to the condition we see in the ARI today, and indeed in the bottom left-hand side picture, which is the pre-works condition of this site at Jubilee Park. So the ARI River landscape has been highly modified and is now largely, unfortunately, a cleared landscape with many threats to platypus populations. And the Platy Patch works in our area and across the state are focusing on correcting those key threatening processes, such as loss of native vegetation, unstable banks, lack of suitable burrow sites, lack of in-stream shelter and in-stream vegetation, and some of those key encroachment pressures from urban systems. As we can see in the left-hand side of this photo, many cypress trees have fallen into the river on this site. They're impacting the stability of the bank and potential ongoing erosion issues. The cypress are also potentially impacting on platypus burrows physically, but also the potential for new burrows to form in these areas. So it's important to note too that this site does go underwater in a large flood. So there's also issues associated with mass movement of soil, and again, those stability issues associated with the bank. So we set to work on undertaking on-ground activities that were improving this site for platypus. And they began with the cypress control of this site. So we removed both the fallen cypress, but also the standing cypress to remove the immediate and future threats to the bank stability of this area. And the project was delivered through the Platy Patch project, but also via local partnerships between the CMA, Warrnambool City Council and local contractors, with support from the community, adjacent landholders and school groups. It's also important to highlight that we were focused on the long-term future of improving this site, and the scale and sequence of works were important aspects to consider. So we only undertook works on this site within a 100-metre section. We staged those works and undertook those works at the appropriate times of the year. So for woody weed control, that was during summer when the ground is the driest, when we're not going to disturb the banks even further through the course of some of these on-ground works. And the cypress trees were removed via methods which involve no digging. So the root balls you can see on the bottom right-hand corner there were left in situ. So we didn't remove the roots and create further bank damage. After the woody weed removal, we installed in-stream habitat structures. So these are man-made structures you can see in the insert picture down the bottom left there. The habitat structures were created using natural materials of eucalypt or gum tree and basalt boulders, and they are a stopgap measure to provide platypus with shelter and to boost those important macroinvertebrate populations, which are the main food source for platypus. So they are a stopgap measure because we hope that in the future our planted trees grow and then drop limbs and provide their own cover and habitat, so we don't have to introduce these man-made solutions. So in the larger picture there, it's a drone image where you can see those in-stream habitat structures installed. So there's 15 spread across this site, and they were installed using a crane to minimise the site disturbance, also to install them in a very controlled way, and we could place them exactly how we wanted them along the bank. After the in-stream habitat installations, we set to work to prepare the site for the new trees or revegetation. So the site was in a disturbed and degraded state prior to us removing the cypress trees, but then during the course of works as well, there was some ground disturbance that we needed to remediate before we put new trees in there. So we brought in some soil to fill the holes, we ground down the stumps, and we spread the mulch that we could across the site to lock in some of that soil moisture. One of the key activities we did during site preparation can be shown in the bottom left-hand picture of this slide. So you can see those brown worm-like structures, which are core logs, and the beige carpet-like structure that basically shadows the top of that bank. So the core logs and the jute matting were important preparation materials to stop the water falling effect and some of those surface water flows damaging the site in large rainfall events prior to us getting vegetation into this site. And the revegetation and the tree planting of this site was certainly the highlight of this project and this particular site. So we worked in partnership with the local Woodford Primary School, Emmanuel College, and also Warrnambool City Council to host a tree planting day. So we had 120 students within 3 groups, so year 11s from Emmanuel College and grades 3 to 6 from Warrnambool Primary School to help re-veg this site. And it was great to see kids outside learning about river health, platypus and their natural environment, native animals, and enjoying themselves, whilst also achieving some great outcomes for our environment. These students are essentially the next caretakers and future generation to be involved in some of these works, and it's great to have them involved and again see themselves enjoying themselves. The site was planted with over 600 native trees, shrubs and grasses, right from the overstory canopy trees, so swamp gums and manna gums, down to the mid-story prickly and woolly tea trees, right down to the grasses, kangaroo, wallaby grass and tussock grasses as well. So these trees were originally endemic to this area, and they existed within this landscape 200 years prior, and it's great to be putting them back to, again, stabilise those banks, get their roots deep down and hold the bank together into the future. So some of the results here. So on the left-hand side, we've got some before works photos, and in the middle, we've got some after works photos. So again, a really good outcome, quite a difference in the site there, but we've had some really great feedback from the local community and on social media. So some of those comments there in the top right-hand photo. And in terms of expected outcomes, as Magdalena mentioned before, we don't expect to see results overnight. There certainly is some short-term boosts associated with in-stream shelter and habitat being installed, but that will be in the immediate, so maybe 1 to 2 year time frame. But then we expect the overall benefits to come later on down the track as the vegetation evolves and matures. So the bottom right-hand photo on this slide is from a revegetation site that's about 6 to 7 years old. And you can see it's grown up tall. It's providing some of those terrestrial outcomes in terms of wildlife for bird life, wallabies and such, but also in-stream for platypus, where those trees are already dropping branches into the river to create those in-stream habitat outcomes. But most importantly, those trees on the right-hand side or bottom right have got their roots deep down into the bank to stabilise the soil, prevent erosion and safeguard some of those platypus burrows. Finally, a bit of a brief snapshot of some of the upcoming work sites in the Glenelg Hopkins region on the Marai and Hopkins River. And again, a lot of this is focusing on correcting some of those threatening processes. So improving burrow sites for platypus, stabilising those banks, increasing native vegetation cover and improving water quality and addressing weed issues. So similar works to what we delivered at Jubilee Park there, but spreading across the wider landscape to have a larger impact and benefit our platypus populations. So that concludes my section of the presentation. So thank you very much. And I'll hand over to Rhys Coleman from Melbourne Water.
Thanks very much, Chris. Great presentation. I'll just share my screen. Okay, hopefully that looks good, Chris. Can you give me a little?
Looks good, Rhys.
Okay, excellent. All right, so yeah, I'm giving the final presentation as part of the Platy Patch series today, and I'll be talking about the Monbulk Creek Smart Water Network, which is the Melbourne-based project. But I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm presenting on behalf of quite a large team, so you can see quite a few names there from a range of organisations, including the University of Melbourne, the Waterway Ecosystem Research Group, Yarra Ranges Council, South East Water and DECA, and also as well as the DQ funding, there's also funding from the ARC. And this research is being conducted on Wurundjeri country, and I'm presenting from Wurundjeri country and Docklands. So Melbourne Water's a water utility, but what a great thing about us is we're also the Waterways and Catchment Manager for Greater Melbourne, and essentially this is the part of the business that this particular project is being driven from. So our Healthy Waterways strategy for Greater Melbourne talks about two challenges for urban waterways in particular. So one of those is population growth or urbanisation, and the other one is climate change. And both of these threats together really have a great risk, I guess, to waterway health into the future, but also provide threats around flooding and safe and reliable drinking water for Melbourne. So in order to meet these challenges, we really need to think about new ways of doing things, so new options that are going to be resilient to a climate future that has a range of plausible futures. So they need to be resilient to those various options. So we have been exploring real-time monitoring and control of urban water storages and thinking about how real-time control of these storages could help us with these challenges. So it's not the silver bullet for everywhere, but we think it could be a really good new tool in our toolbox that could be very effective in some contexts. So I'll start by just talking about stormwater management and what we typically do in places like Melbourne. So we typically have water-sensitive urban design features like rainwater tanks on private property, rain gardens, stormwater wetlands, all trying to capture that stormwater, treat that stormwater before it hits the waterway, and helping to take the peak off the high flow events and also help to provide increased flows during dry weather. So these systems are very helpful in terms of managing stormwater, but we think we can get more out of them if we actively manage them rather than let them passively operate. And what I mean by that is that typically, say for a stormwater wetland, we'll design them with a certain weir height, and the water will come in from a storm event and then go out based on that fixed weir height. But we think if we can actively manage these systems rather than passively, we can get a whole lot more out of them. And there's also some limitations if we think about rainwater tanks, for example, on private property, is they may be helpful for stormwater management, but if they're not maintained properly, or if there's malfunctions, then we don't necessarily know about it and we're not getting the outcomes we're looking for. And also too, if they're just passively operating, as I mentioned before, there's no real ability to be adaptable to a changing climate. So we think that if we're able to actively operate these storages, so know how much water is in each of them, and then be able to make decisions about how much water to release each day from those storages, that we can get these benefits such as reduce flood risk. So if we have a whole lot of storages in a catchment, including rainwater tanks, and we see that there's a storm coming in the next few days, we can pre-release water from those storages so that when the storm comes, it can take up more of that event. And this also helps with stormwater capture and reduces impacts of stormwater on waterway health. If we make controlled releases of water from these storages as well, we can start to provide environmental water benefits. So about providing the water, the right volume at the right time for the creek. And there's also additional benefits if we have smart tanks on private properties, then we can think about augmenting the non-potable household water use like toilet flushing or garden watering. So we've got a case study for Monbulk, the Monbulk Creek Smart Water Network. And Monbulk Creek is a tributary of Dandenong Creek in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne on Wurundjeri country. And it has forested headwaters that then transition into sort of low density urban commercial areas like Belgrave and Upwey. There's about 5,000 houses in the catchment and there's a fair amount of public open space, which is great. There's also 3 urban water storages, Belgrave Lake, which is a decommissioned water supply, hasn't been used for a long time. And there's also 2 lakes within the Monbulk Creek Retarding Basin, or Birdsland Reserve as it's otherwise known. And the creek supports a whole range of aquatic life, including threatened platypus. This image here gives you a sense of what the network looks like. So smart tanks on people's properties connected to the drainage network that then flows into the creek. And then we have smart lakes like the Monbulk Creek Retarding Basin lakes or Belgrave Lake that are also smart, and we know about water levels and can remotely release water from those storages for those multiple benefits. So unfortunately, platypus in the Monbulk Creek catchment have been declining through time since the trapping surveys commenced in the mid-90s with the Australian Platypus Conservancy, and we've been continuing those until current day. So we've got some really good data, but unfortunately those data show us that platypus are declining, and they've also declined in other parts of the Dandenong Creek catchment. So there's 5 major catchments across Melbourne: Werribee, Maribyrnong, Yarra, Dandenong and Western Port. You can see them on the figures in the bottom right. So the Monbulk Creek population is the last platypus population in Dandenong Creek, in that whole area. So we're very, very keen to try and do something to protect this population. In addition to that, we did some habitat suitability modelling for platypus as part of the Healthy Waterways strategy. And that work predicted that if we just continue as we are now, then we're likely to lose platypus for Monbulk Creek and other areas across Melbourne. And one of the major threats to the decline of platypus is habitat drying. So what do we need to achieve for Monbulk Creek? So we're really focusing on trying to do something about the minimum flows to support platypus feeding and breeding. So that's trying to maintain at least 2 megalitres per day during summer and at least 5 megalitres per day during winter as a minimum flow. So that comes from our environmental flow plan that was developed by Jacobs back in 2017. So we thought, well, that's a good place to start in terms of what we're trying to achieve. So we also got Jacobs to do some modelling work for us to say, well, all right, if we put in this network, this smart network, how do we think that might improve our flow compliance? And the pleasing thing about that work was that it suggested that just with the lakes, the 3 lakes alone, that we could meet our minimum flow target 75% of the time with real-time control compared to only 40% of the time at the moment. So that was a big gain. So that was part of the business case. We'd also really like to do something about high flows and the potential risk of high flows to juveniles in burrows and potential drowning risks. But that's going to be a whole lot harder, and we're trying to work through what that might look like. So installation of the smart tanks. So on your right there is an example of a smart tank, and then it's connected to that smart box there, the one box. So that's Southeast Water Technology. So you can see that box below, and that's what essentially allows us to control the amount of water in the smart tanks. So at the moment, we predict there's about 1,000 properties that are connected directly to the stormwater network. So we think they're good candidates for smart tanks. We're aiming to install up to 300 residential tanks in the project. And we're also working with council sites and school sites and commercial sites as well to see if we can boost that number. The rainwater tanks are connected for indoor uses mainly at the moment, so for toilet flushing. And they've also got an outlet that we can open that valve remotely, and then we can release water directly into the stormwater network for environmental watering. And if we release that water prior to well prior to a storm event, for flood protection. And then there's a valve in there that is operated by the one box to allow us to do those releases. So in terms of residents being part of this program, so there's Yarra Rangers are leading all the expressions of interest that are going out to residents to be part of it. And the project will cover the cost of tank installation and also maintenance for 5 years. And then what happens beyond that, we will need to negotiate that with the households. And as part of doing that, we ask that they give us at least 50% of that tank for the project. So that's the bottom 50%. And then everything above that, they can use for toilet flushing. But they can also, there's a user interface. So that's an example of it on the right there, where residents can go online and they can look at their tank and levels in their tank, and they can look at how releases have happened from the tank and water in the creek and what the flows are like in the creek. And they can also change that reserve volume, so they can go above 50% if they want to. Here's an idea of the urban lakes. So Monbulk Creek retarding basin on the right, that's one of them, and Belgrave Lake, or you can see the dam wall of Belgrave Lake on the left. So they've got quite a good holding capacity, so almost 43 megalitres of holding capacity. So they're really important for increasing our ability to provide environmental water along with the smart tanks. So in terms of how we operate this network, so each day we send release requests. So release requests go to Southeast Water for the smart tanks, and requests go to Melbourne Water for the smart lakes. And we make decisions about how much water to release each day based upon what's the current flow in Monbulk Creek at that time, what's the predicted rainfall forecast over the next 7 days, and how much water do we have in all the various storages. So basically that rule-based system happens overnight, and then the next morning the release requests go out. And it may be you don't need to release anything today, but then it could be lakes or tanks. It just depends on those rules. So how are we going with this project? Well, there's a lot of community engagement going on, being led by Yarra Rangers Council. The installation of the smart tanks are underway, so we expect to probably have somewhere around about 30 tanks by Christmas, or the equivalent of 30 tanks. We've retrofitted the 2 lakes at Birdsland Reserve, so they're done, and then the 3rd lake, Belgrave Lake, is scheduled to be done in early 2026. We've developed the release request algorithm and system along with the user interface, so that's all up and running. We're very, very lucky to have some great long-term data around hydrology, macroinvertebrates and platypus, and we're collecting more data as part of the research project to be able to assess changes in those things through operation of the network. As we learn more through this research program, we'll be refining our water release objectives and rules. And also there's a dedicated social research program looking at the attitudes and behaviours of residents towards the smart technology. So in conclusion, the driver for the smart network is waterway health and platypus in particular, but there are additional benefits that we expect for households and flood protection and households and flood protection. It's a demonstration of a new technology and the potential of smart networks to allow us to adapt to changing climates, a proof of concept that we can apply in other contexts. So, and not necessarily just for platypus, it could be, perhaps primarily for flood protection somewhere else. A unique thing about it is it's bringing together water authorities, local government and the community to be actively managing urban water. And then into the future, some of the things that we'll be looking at will be around incentives and what sort of incentives we feel are going to encourage participation in these sorts of networks, and will also generate lessons around the social and environmental benefits that can inform business cases for adoption of similar networks elsewhere. And that's it. Thank you. And I think it's over to you, James.
Thanks, Rhys, and thanks, Chris and Magda as well. A really informative set of presentations covering, obviously, the science, the on-ground application or restoration going on, and of course, the work that's happening in Monbulk Creek around the innovative water solutions. So there is time for questions. So please, if you've got some questions, please put them in the chat. And we've already got some already. So I might work my way down from top to bottom. Perhaps Magda, starting with you, the number of sites across the state, obviously, there's a question there about urban sites, and Monbulk Creek is one of those, of course. But are there other urban sites? And maybe if you could also just give us a sense of how the sites were selected across Victoria.
Yeah, sure. So in the sense of urban, most of them are urban or peri-urban, because that's part of the grant requirements. So they all actually urban significant areas, which means that there has to be more than 10,000, I think it's 10,000 people or more living in these areas. So it does revolve around all these regional centres, as was shown on the map a bit earlier, and can't be outside those centres more than about 500 metres. So I think that answers that. And in terms of how they were selected, I pretty much just said that, so that they had to be part of the USA, the urban significant areas. And they were selected because we knew that there were platypus there. So all the CMAs had that background information as well, and took that into account when selecting sites. So I don't know if Chris might want to add something to this, being the expert on the on-ground work side of things.
I certainly can do, Magdalena, and yeah, similar to what you said, the works across Warrnambool have been delivered where there is existing populations of platypus and where we have identified some of those key threatening processes occurring. So we're trying to remediate those sites, and the funding through Platy Patch has given us the opportunity to work on some of these sites to improve them for the resident populations of platypus. So high priority sites that we now can do works to benefit them.
Thanks, Chris. Magda, maybe one for you too. There's a question there about how significant is inbreeding depression in platypus populations, maybe across Victoria, but there's a specific reference there to the Otways.
Yeah, sure. I can say a few things. It's a bit outside my area of expertise, obviously, so I can sort of just recite what's in the literature. So I think in general that there tends to be an indication that there are 4 major groups of platypus in Australia. There's definitely inbred populations. However, in terms of implication of the low genetic diversity, I think that's less clear. There's no obvious negative effects in the current population. That doesn't mean that they are resilient should there be a weather event or some major change. So by and large, I would say that we still would need more data. A bit of an interesting study came out a couple of years ago, which looked at the genetic differentiation between populations on either set, or in a population when there was a dam or a weir obstructing the flow of individuals or the dispersion of individuals, and it did indicate that there was quite a genetic differentiation as in post-ballot fragmentation. So I can pop some references in the chat, but otherwise, yes, I'm not an expert in this area, so I don't know if Rhys has any more to add.
We've done a fair bit of genetic work in Melbourne, so some stuff that Elise Furlan did, and then more recently with EnviroDNA. So we've got some pretty good data on the genetics of the Melbourne populations, and certainly there are some small isolated populations where you'd be thinking that's a greater risk. And I think the idea of inbreeding is on our radar, and I think the way that we're looking at it is to continue to do that genetic monitoring, and then, you know, I guess at some point in time think about, well, is it time to intervene? And I guess that's our strategy for now, and we'd have to think carefully about what that looked like, because it means taking platypus from other populations and bringing them into, you know, other ones where there's been decline. So I think a lot of thought needs to go into that. Yeah.
Yep. I mean, like a lot of genetic rescue, there's a fair bit of planning and information and evidence that needs to go into them, and you need to think about both the source and the sink populations and the impacts. Specific one here, Chris, for you, question about the other side of the bank. Are you operating on private land, or is this Crown land frontages, or what's happening there?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for the question there, Kelly. So our Platy Patch project operates both on private land and public land. So the opposite bank, which I think you're referring to, is the other side of the river to Jubilee Park. So it is private land. We operate on a voluntary basis with landholders, and we've undertaken an expression of interest period. So we are hoping to work on the adjacent bank there, and there's certainly capacity through Platy Patch. And we're working towards basically completion of the project by 2028. So we're hoping for a bit of an opportunity to work on that section of private land, and we're trying our best to achieve that.
Right, thank you. Maybe Chris, while you've got the mic, there's a question there around the logs and the debris introduced, and obviously the images you had the chains around the logs. So do you want to talk a little bit about what the purpose of the chains is, and how whether those things are anchored down or not?
Yeah, so great question there, Kim, and thank you. So the habitat structures, they've got the logs in there, but you'll notice down the bottom of those logs, they've got some chains on them, anchor them to some quite significant basalt boulders. So the chains assist with installation, but they also drop down when they go into the river, and basically are positioned in such a way where the flows try and push them in a way where they don't move as well. So as time goes by and vegetation grows, we find that, they're not floating and they're not moving as such in a flood situation.
And maybe a secondary question from me, Chris, because obviously the issue of in-stream debris kind of creating their own problems during flood events and so forth, has it been tested much in this sort of technique in the past?
Yeah, so there's a lot of in-stream habitat that has gone in, and I guess the benefits of some of that debris build-up are those more sheltered areas, and some of those macroinvertebrate populations get right in there. But I guess there's always room for more monitoring and more kind of work in this space. So the flood events might come around every so many years, and we don't get a lot of opportunities to, I guess, monitor before and after works, which we certainly do in the near future if that was available.
Great, thank you. One here for Rhys. The kind of broader application, Rhys, of the sort of technology that you're installing in Monbulk Creek, and whether there's an opportunity to kind of use something similar in other catchments, and, you know, kind of the whole issue of stormwater management and the like. Any comments on that?
Yeah, so I mean, we're obviously Southeast Water already part of the project, and we've been having some conversations with Yarra Valley Water as well. So water utilities are certainly showing a lot of interest in this, and we've been having conversations with DECA as well, and I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of interest in smart technology in new developments to help with, you know, in general stormwater and flooding issues, and I think we can learn a lot from Monbulk that'll be relevant to those other projects where they're being considered. Yeah, but it's certainly being talked about. Yeah,
great stuff. Yeah, I mean, I guess particularly in urban environments, the whole issue of, you know, extreme highs and extreme lows is just the problem, right? So things that
Yeah,
can
that's
help
right. Yeah.
mitigate those extreme events is the way to go.
Yeah, too much water when it's wet and not enough water when it's dry.
Yep.
And trying to be able to get that balance as best as we can with the, these smart tanks, I think certainly it's a good option. And as I tried to emphasise earlier, like I don't think it's the solution for everywhere, but yeah, I think there'll be contexts where it'll be very appropriate. Yeah.
My guess is that the smart tanks may have filled up last night or yesterday at least.
We've got some water to play with.
Yeah. One for you, perhaps, Chris, around the focus of the revegetation. Is it on bank stabilisation, or is it about debris, or is it about shading? What's the aim there with and maybe the different kind of layers of vegetation that you're planting?
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking, certainly not a plant ecologist, but the focus of the revegetation in these projects is a combined benefit, I guess. So the stability of the banks to get those tussock grasses in quickly to provide short-term stabilisation of the banks, and then get the mid-story and larger story in there as well, so they provide the long-term stability of the banks. And I guess in terms of combined habitat benefit for platypus, we do see the dropping of some of those large limbs, particularly the gum trees, providing that in-stream shelter at the 7+ year mark. So certainly on-bank vegetation has benefits in terms of providing in-stream habitat and in-stream shelter, but also mainly for the macroinvertebrates, I guess. So without some of that riparian vegetation and some of those branches and vegetation there, we have a decreased number, but also decreased type of macroinvertebrates that we find in the water column. Some fall from the riparian vegetation on the bank, but some come from in-stream vegetation. So from my knowledge of that, there's certainly habitat benefits for platypus in that space. And climate adaptation I can see as well. So yeah, we certainly use vegetation that's locally endemic to the area, but also have a portion that come from hotter, drier areas as well to try and stop that into the future.
Great, thank you. I think that's all we've got in the chat. So I might ask everyone to put their virtual hands together to thank our three presenters on three really interesting presentations, and we really look forward to seeing some of the outcomes and the reporting on those outcomes as we go forward. So if there's an opportunity, we can try to update participants today with information as it comes to hand, and obviously stay tuned to the ARI website for updates on the project more generally. So thanks, guys, for three great presentations. I hope, is that a real comment? Just a reminder that so this may be our last ARI seminar for the year. We're still just thinking about whether we've able to squeeze in one in November, but please, if you want to stay updated on the seminars, then please go to the ARI website, and you can also see previous seminar recordings there. So for any particular sessions you may have missed, you can go back and have a look at those. And as always, we're really interested in making these as useful as possible for people who attend. And so if you've got any suggestions on feedback, then please complete the form, and that'd be much appreciated. So thanks to everyone again for our presenters. We had about 180 odd people at the peak there, guys. So well done. A lot of interest in this topic. Obviously, platypus is a much loved species by many, and while the outlook is a little bit grim in terms of the decline of the population in Victoria, the work that you guys are doing is going to be fundamental to trying to recover this species over time. So thank you for all your efforts. Thanks to all our people who've joined us today, and also those people who have joined us throughout the year. We look forward to continuing to present these and provide these seminars as we go forward. So thanks all, and have a great week. Cheerio.